Okay, Dave, tá sé jazz a bheith an seo a nucht gur mí mágat. Tonight we're going to do a little talk about James Connolly. I spent a long time writing a book on Connolly, and one of the dangers is that if you start looking into one of your heroes, that you might discover he has feet of clay. But one amazing thing about Connolly is everything he wrote, everything he said, it's as pertinent today as it was 100 years ago, and he's always on the right side, he's always on the side of the underdog. And I always think it had a lot to do with his birth in Edinburgh in the Cowgate. He was born exactly at 107 the Cowgate, which was known as Little Ireland, and it was really the slums that he was raised in. His mother and father were both from Ireland. Mary McGinn was his mother's name and John Connolly was his father's name, and they had 3 sons altogether. And of course Connolly was the youngest, and he went to school in a local school, St. Patrick's, and at the age of 11 he left school and he went to work for the Edinburgh Evening News as what's called a printer's devil, where he was basically a dog's body. But there was a visit from a factory inspector, and despite the use of a box for him to stand on, it was quite clear he was too young to be working, and he went on to work in a bakery. But this was very hard work for a small boy, and he was quite small of stature as well, and the work nearly killed him. And then eventually, when he was about 13, he got a job in a mosaic factory, which seemed to be a little bit easier. But at the age of 14, he decided that he would follow his brother John, and he took the King's Shilling and joined the British Army. He went off with the King's Liverpool Regiment, and they were stationed, of course, in Ireland. And when he arrived in Ireland, it was 1882. So just to remind you what was going on, this was the Land War. Burke and Cavendish had been assassinated in the Phoenix Park. An amazing sort of time for him to be brought to Ireland when there was such sort of revolution in the air, you might say. But initially he was in Cork, and we can follow his regiment. We can't follow him because he signed up under a false name and gave a false age as well. But we know what his regiment did. They went to the Curragh, and eventually they ended up in Beggar's Bush Barracks. But I think his time in the army, he must have been a very lonely soul, because he didn't drink and he didn't smoke, and he called the British Army a veritable cesspool, a moral cesspool that corrupted all within its bounds. So I think we can take it that he didn't enjoy that time. Now, there are some biographies of James Connolly which try to assert that he spent his time in Dublin reading socialism, but it wasn't really till he got back to Scotland that he got involved in that. But before we discuss that, I'll explain to you, he also met a young Protestant girl in Dublin. They missed a tram together, and that gave them something in common, and he struck up a conversation. Lily Reynolds was her name. She's from Wicklow. She wasn't the kind of wealthy sort of Protestant type that you might kind of think of. She was a serving girl working in Rathmines, but they fell in love, and it turned out that Connolly's regiment were about to be shipped off to India, and he really didn't fancy that because his time was nearly up, and the last thing he wanted was to be coming out of his time in the British Army while he was in India, because it would have been very hard for him to get back as well. So he decided to go absent without leave, and he nipped off to Scotland, where he lived in Dundee for a while. And his letters to Lily are kind of beautiful. They're sort of wonderfully naive. He tells her that they're going to get married very soon in Perth, but he also explained to her that there wouldn't be much of a honeymoon because he was leading one of the ringleaders in a strike, and they should look upon him very badly if he wasn't around during the strike. So she knew, in a sense, what she was about to sign up to, a life where socialism would always take a greater place than his personal life in many ways. Now, they moved to Edinburgh eventually, and they had a little kitchen there where there was many meetings of the Scottish Labour Party, which was a branch of Keir Hardy's Independent Labour Party. He was involved in various socialist organisations there, the Social Democratic Federation. There's lots of these acronyms as well, the SSF as well. Suffice to say that if there was a socialist organisation in Scotland at the time, Connolly was involved. He also befriended a great character over there, John Leslie is his name. They became a very close friend with the family. But Connolly's socialism meant he ended up being blacklisted, so he decided to open up a cobbler's shop. And his advertisement is kind of funny because he says, Connolly repairs the worn out understandings of the brethren at the standard rates. But Alice Munro, who was one of his comrades, decided she'd do him a favour and brought all the family's shoes to Connolly to fix up. And she said not one pair was wearable afterwards. So his skills were not in the cobbler. One of his comrades says to him, how's business? He says, I'm going to spend my last shilling buying a shaving mirror and watch myself slowly starve to death. So at the time, because he was out of money, there was an offer from the Chilean government in South America that they would give you 200 acres of land if you were a European, and they would pay for you to come over to Chile. But this was what he decided was the future. But Lily found out that he would also need to bring a rifle with him to defend the land or whatever, and she freaked out a bit about this, and maybe she had a premonition about what his life would end up being involved in. But it's interesting to think about how the history of Chile might have been very much different had James Connolly ended up over there, but he didn't, because John Leslie put an advertisement in Justice, Socialist magazine, for a job for Connolly, and it was answered, of course, famously by the Dublin Socialist Club, who invited Connolly over to Ireland and his family as the organiser for their club. Now, when he arrived in Ireland, again in 1896, he disbanded the Dublin Socialist Club. That was the first thing he did, and he founded another party, the Irish Socialist Republican Party, which one right commentator in the media said had more syllables than members. So it wasn't a big party, but nonetheless they had a very beautiful manifesto as well. If I may just read a little, some of the lines from the manifesto, from which just happens to be my book, which just happens to be there as well, available in all good bookstores. Some of the aspects of it are very interesting because they're things we take for granted today, but 100 years ago would have been considered wildly impossible. Nationalisation of railways and canals. Well, that's something we did do in Ireland. Abolition of private banks and money lending institutions, and the establishment of state banks under popularly elected boards of directors. The establishment of rural depots for the most improved agricultural machinery. So cooperatives, essentially, you know, a graduated income tax on all incomes over £400 per annum, which was a lot of money at the time. But here's an interesting one as well. Free maintenance for all children. Now, that's something we've got as well. Not completely free maintenance, but we have the children's allowance as well. Legislative restriction of hours of labour to 48 hours per week, and the establishment of a minimum wage. You know, people would have thought this was absolutely off the wall, like, right? But here's a good one here. Free education up to the highest university grades, and one that people would have laughed at the time, universal suffrage, that men and women would have the same voting rights. So what he is here, you can see, is he's a trailblazer. He's way ahead of his time with all those ideals. And again, I reiterate, he has stood the test of time in that respect. Now, he had a membership card for the Irish Socialist Republican Party, which was in emerald green, and that steering aphorism of Camille Desmoulins, the French revolutionary pamphleteer, the great appear great because we are on our knees, let us rise. That was on the back of it as well. And of course that's on a statue in Dublin of Jim Larkin, if you're ever in the city. That's in French, and it's in Gaeilge as well. Niúsal, Éanúsal, Ach Sinna Bheith, Íosil, Riamish. One of the things he did in Ireland as well in those early days was he reprinted Fintan Lawler's pamphlets, The Fate of a Felon and the Rights of Ireland as well. And it was said that he rescued the memory of that great young Irelander who, of course, died in prison after being one of the organisers of the 1848 uprising, and a further one in 1849, a smaller one. And it was Lawler who was very influential on James Connolly. Don't forget that Lawler was the one who came up with that lovely phrase, Who will draw the first blood for Ireland? Who will win a wreath that shall be forever green? So those Lawler pamphlets attracted the attention of Alice Milligan here in Belfast, and she reprinted them in Shan Van Vogt, the poor old woman. And collectively, with various other things that he wrote, he decided to collect them all together and published a pamphlet which is known as Erin's Hope, the End and the Means. May I just quote from that very famous line: "If you remove the English army tomorrow and hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle, unless you set about the organisation of the Socialist Republic, your efforts would be in vain. England would still rule you. She would rule you through her capitalists, through her landlords, through her financiers, and through the whole array of commercial and individualist institutions she has planted in this country and watered with the tears of our mothers and the blood of our martyrs." So you can see a man here who can write very well, and don't forget he left school at the age of 11, so you can only imagine what a higher education he would have achieved with that. And he's very much self-educated. He needed every shilling he got, because I forgot to mention he had 2 kids when he was in Edinburgh, Mona and Nora, but another 2 arrived while he was in Dublin, Aideen and Ina. So the family is grown. He became great friends with a great revolutionary female, Maud Gonne, as well, and in 1897 both of them protested the jubilee of the famine queen, Victoria, and they had a coffin painted up with British Empire written on the side of it, and a hand cart dressed up like a hearse, you know, and they came down Dame Street, a good few of them, you know, and the police stopped them on O'Connell Bridge. And there was a bit of a melee, and Connolly grabbed the coffin and shoved it into the River Liffey. "To hell with the British Empire," says he, and was promptly arrested for one night. And Maud Gonne, fair play to her, she paid for his bail the following day. But 1898 is a very important year, and that's the centenary of the United Irishmen, of course. And to celebrate that, Connolly and his comrades decided to found a newspaper, the Workers' Republic, and in the first issue they very much talked about Wolfe Tone. And I really like this quote about Wolfe Tone from James Connolly. He was crucified, and when I say it, think about James Connolly later on. "He was crucified in life, now he is idolised in death. And the men who push forward most arrogantly to burn incense at the altar of his fame are drawn from the very class who, were he alive today, would hasten to repudiate him as a dangerous malcontent." Now, the connection there, I think that's very pertinent with 2016, when you had various Irish politicians rushing to burn incense at Connolly's altars, but the very politicians who would have repudiated physical force republicanism were up there laying wreaths at Connolly's grave. If you see the connection there, you know, you had a strange bunch of people who were involved in the official commemoration of 1898 of the 1798 uprising, which included William Martin Murphy, you know, the hated Employers Federation later on. So that was the caliber of individual who was involved in commemorating 1798. You know, it's incredible. And many of the Home Rulers as well were involved in that, and Connolly called them out, so he did, you know. But in the first issue, he also explained why we are socialist and why we are Republican. "We are socialist because we recognise in it the only principle by which the working class can live as men and not as mere profit-making machines. We are Republicans because we are socialists, and therefore enemies to all privileges, and because we would have the Irish people complete masters of their own destinies, nationally and internationally, fully competent to work out their own salvation. So very steering stuff. Of course, a major event that the British Empire were involved in, that imperialism was involved in, was the Boer War, the Second Boer War, which is 1899 to 1901. And Connolly came out against it, obviously, and he wrote something very beautiful about it. He said that the Boer War was essentially an unscrupulous gang of capitalists to allow them to get into their hands the immense riches of the diamond fields. A war waged by a mighty empire against a nation entirely incapable of replying in any effective manner, by a government of financiers upon a nation of farmers, by a capitalist ring who will never see a shot fired during the war upon a people defending their homes and liberties. Such is the war upon which the people of England are criminally or stupidly allowing their government to enter. So again, that's the way we would analyse the Boer War today, but way back then people thought it was a great old war that Britain was involved in, little realising that they were after the gold and the diamonds in South Africa. In 1900, as the song says, the Queen, she came to call on us. Queen Victoria decided to pay a little visit to Ireland, and it was great for those who were loyal to the crown. They got the chance to display their loyalty by hanging Union flags outside their homes and in their shops, and a huge event was organised in the Phoenix Park to feed the children of Dublin who were loyal to the crown, and they expected 10,000 children to come out, and all these local companies like Jacob's Biscuit Factory, they gave a ton of biscuits. Williams and Woods gave 10,000 bags of sweets. You know, they were falling over each other to show how loyal they were to the British. And Connolly and Maud Gonne organised a patriotic children's treat, an alternative treat, and they managed to get 20,000 children come to their event, which must have been a great victory for them, to show, you know, that the Dublin kids were more interested in Ireland than the free food they were going to get from the famine queen, as I say, you know. And on the subject of children, the Connolly family grew by two more with the arrival of Moira and a son, Roderick, better known later on as Roddy. But 1901 also saw the publication of another collection of Connolly's essays called the New Evangel. So he was beginning to make a name for himself, and he felt confident enough to run for local elections in 1902. Now he got 431 votes, which doesn't sound like an awful lot, but the fellow who won only got 1,000 more. So, you know, he polled quite well for a socialist and a revolutionary. And fair play to him, he issued one of his appeals in Yiddish as well, to appeal to Jewish voters as well. So he's kind of very, very internationalist in that respect. But he attracted the attention of a famous fellow over in America called Daniel de Leon, who was the self-appointed head of the Socialist Labour Party over there. Now, de Leon was the kind of fella who you didn't want to cross, but he wanted to impress Irish socialists in America by bringing over this renowned representative of the working class over to the States, you know, and it would cement his power with the Irish over there in the States. Connolly's reason for going, besides the fact that it's a great thing to go and visit America in those days, but his real reason for going was he knew he might be able to sell subscriptions to the Workers' Republic newspaper, so it was highly advantageous for him. And he spoke in Cooper Union in 1902. And by the way, the New York Times reported on his arrival, "Agitator Connolly arrives," you know. So it was newsworthy enough for them to have it on page 3 or 4 of their newspaper. But he spoke in Cooper Union, and I'm sure he didn't miss that Lincoln also spoke in Cooper Union. So he felt the weight of history there, and it was a great event. He spoke about how some of the home rule movement were actually slum landlords as well. And he said, no person can be, I'm going to mess this up, but I'll try it. No person can be economically free unless they are politically free, and no person can be politically free unless they are economically free. And there was huge cheers and hats thrown in the air, and off he went on his lecture tour. Now, downstairs in the Connolly Centre, and if you've never been here, it's absolutely absolutely fantastic. They have mapped out all of Connolly's lecture tour on a big screen. It's amazing to see how far he went all across the states, as far as Butte, Montana, and down south as well. So he really covered an awful lot of ground, and he raised a lot of money. And he was sending it home to the comrades over in Ireland. But sadly, when he arrived back around the new year of 1903, he got some bad news, because the comrades had been spending the money to make up the shortfall in a bar that they had set up in the clubhouse. And because Connolly was teetotal, well, regardless of that, he was very annoyed that all his hard work that he had done over there, that they had basically spent the money on drink. So a big row developed, and between the jigs and the reels, they separated. He went his way and they went their way. Now, he did a brief tour over in Scotland and in England, but he decided America was his destination. And in 1903, he set sail for New York again. This time though, Daniel de Leon, who he hoped might give him a job, had no real interest in him anymore. And instead, Connolly got a job, and it's a bizarre one for him. He was working for Metropolitan Life as a dues collector, you know, and the idea was he would work hard and then bring the family over the following year. Now, the darkest period of Connolly's life is when the whole family were going to join him in the US, and his eldest daughter, Mona, in a terrible household accident, she caught fire and she died on the very day that they were due to set sail. They were going to go that night. So he was waiting for his family, the 6 kids and his wife Lily, to arrive in Ellis Island. And they were delayed, obviously, because of the accident. And he waited and waited, and eventually only 5 kids and the wife arrived. So you can imagine the shock on his to his system when he discovered that Mona had died. Now, the worst of all is that Mona was due to come with him in the first place. That was the idea, but there wasn't enough money for 2 tickets. So, you know, he kind of, I suppose he felt very guilty about this, and it was a dark period for him. But the family moved to Troy, and they set up a house there and did their best. The weather was a funny thing that affected Connolly very badly. He wrote to one of his comrades over there, he says, "It is fearfully hot for me in America, but the Americans say it is exceptionally cool. It is obvious to me that hell will be a greater punishment to us than the Americans, another injustice for old Ireland." So he could be quite witty, you know. One time he was giving a lecture and a fella shouted up to him, "You seem to know everything. Who'll win the derby?" And Connolly says, "A horse, but I'm surprised at an ass asking." So he was quick off the mark, so he was, like, you know. But there was a downturn in the economy around 1904, 1905, and Connolly lost his job with MetLife because no one was paying insurance anymore. So he went down to New York, and he used to tramp around with a couple of his comrades from Ireland trying to find work and find the cheapest place to eat, which was anywhere below 10 cents for a meal. And he used to give these dives funny kind of names. Like, he called one place the Waldorf because it was the complete opposite of the famous fancy hotel. But another one he called the coffee without onions, because he was getting a coffee there one day and there was onions floating in the bottom of the cup. So the next time he went in, he said, "Coffee without onions," and he said the waiter shouted through the hatch, "Coffee without onions." So that was the name of that place forevermore. But eventually he got a job with the Singer Sewing Factory. He passed himself off as a lathe operator, and he worked there and brought the family down from Troy to live there in New York, you know. But around about this time, 1905, a very huge organisation was founded in the United States. They're called the Industrial Workers of the World, better known as the Wobblies. And they were founded by people like Big Bill Haywood, Eugene Debs, the Cork woman Mary Harris, or Mother Jones, Father Haggerty as well. Father Haggerty coined that great phrase, socialism, when you take it really slowly, you know, too slowly, or socialists. But Charles Moyer as well. But a fantastic organisation. Now, Connolly didn't get involved with them immediately. That would come in a couple of years. But an organisation that he would become the New York organiser for. But around about 1906, there was a fella called Frank Stenenberg. Now he was an anti-union former governor of Idaho, and he was killed in a bomb blast, right? And they tried to pin it on two of the Wobblies, Haywood and Moyer. But James Connolly was involved in the Haywood-Moyer trial fund, so raising money in New York to help defend those two innocent men, completely innocent. It turned out it was a fella called Horsley, Albert Horsley, and it was a Pinkerton detective who put him up to saying that it was the other two, and it all came out at trial that was a complete fabrication. But it gives you an idea of the depths that the Americans were willing to stoop to destroy anyone who had a socialist agenda. But it also brought Connolly into the forefront of the Wobblies, and eventually, as I say, he was appointed New York organizer from 1908 to 1910. There was a famous New York mayor, George B. McLennan is his name, and he once said in 1907, "There are Russian socialists, there are Jewish socialists, and there are Swedish socialists, but thank God there are no Irish socialists." And James Connolly found this as a bit of a challenge, so he set up the Irish Socialist Federation with Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who's a fantastic woman altogether. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was very young when she met Connolly. I think she was 17 or 18, and she has a great book, by the way, I Speak My Own Words, if you're ever looking for a good read. It's a lovely quote because she was speaking on a corner, and some Hollywood producer came up to her and he said, "I want you for my movies." And she said, "I speak my own words," which is a lovely phrase altogether. But they also founded a newspaper called The Harp, which was a little organ. James Connolly kept in touch with with Bill O'Brien over in Ireland, and Bill sent him plenty of news. So the newspaper did quite well amongst the Irish community around the States. Now, around about this time, he also penned a heap of songs, 7 or 8 songs, and he collected them into a songbook. In the preface, he wrote a lovely piece, which I'm going to read, if that's okay. So this is the preface from the songbook. "No revolutionary movement is complete without its poetical expression. If such a movement has caught hold of the imagination of the masses, they will seek a vent in song for the aspirations, the fears and hopes, the loves and hatreds engendered by the struggle. Until the movement is marked by the joyous, defiant singing of revolutionary songs, it lacks one of the distinctive marks of a popular revolutionary movement. It is a dogma of a few and not the faith of the multitude." So he undertook another lecture as well, by the way, of New York, where he was selling his songbook and he was selling his pamphlets as well. So he's doing quite well. But in 1908, he met a fellow called Charles Kerr in Chicago. And Charles ran a socialist publishing house which had 2,000 members who all subscribed. So between the two of them, they agreed that he would print Connolly's new book, which has a lovely title, Socialism Made Easy. And I don't know about you, but I have read books that should have been called Marxism Made More Difficult Than You Could Possibly Understand. And it's designed in some ways to almost put you off. But Socialism Made Easy does exactly what it says on the cover and makes it simple, because it's for working men and women. And it's not for professors to be able to, interpret Marx. It's for people like Connolly to interpret it simply for people. The capitalists have it all and we have nothing. That's the simple message, Anyway, he was on a farewell tour of the States in 1909, which I think lasted nearly 8 or 9 months. Again, all around the USA. But he was keeping in touch, as I said, with his comrades in Ireland, and Bill O'Brien wrote to him and asked him would he come for a lecture over in Ireland, and the whole fate of Ireland and the whole fate of his family was about to change in 1910, because he told Lily he was just going over on a lecture tour, but then he ended up getting a full-time job with the Socialist Party of Ireland, and as an organiser, and he wrote to Lily and said, listen, pack up everything, come back home. So I often feel very sorry for her because, you know, every time she was just about to set up and things were going very well, he seemed to get itchy feet and move on, like, you know. So diligent as she was, she followed him over to Ireland, but she insisted that they wouldn't be living in the slums in Dublin, and he got them a nice house in a place called Rosetta Terrace in Ringsend. Now, we were talking amongst ourselves here earlier on about the price of rent in Dublin, and it's phenomenal to think that there are still landlords who are the scourge of society, who are ripping people off to the extent that they do here. And Belfast is at the moment cheaper than Dublin, but it was the same 100 years ago. And when Connolly found out the rent in Belfast, he decided that the family would be better off up here. So the family instead moved down the road here to Glenalina Terrace, and they set up shop here. And it was a lucky move in a sense, because around about 1911, work dried up with the Socialist Party, and luckily, maybe because of his position as well, where the family were living, he was appointed Ulster organiser for the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. Big Jim Larkin's very important union, which had the great phrase, the great badge, OBU, based on the Wobblies, one big union. So Connolly got involved in a number of strikes here in Belfast, and he's very non-sectarian. You know, he founded the non-sectarian Labour Band, which was composed of Catholic and Protestant dock workers as well. He also did a lot of works with the women in the linen industry here. He called them the linen slaves of Belfast, which he describes as slaughterhouses for the women and penitentiaries for the children. But 3,000 women packed into a hall and proclaimed their allegiance to a new textile branch of the Transport and General Workers Union, and went on strike for better pay and for better conditions as well. But Connolly really came into his own around 1913, when the great lockout happened in Dublin, the great strikes, when Jim Larkin and James Connolly took on the Employers' Federation, which was made up of 400 huge employers, led by William Martin Murphy in Dublin. It started around August 1913, when the tram workers came out and the paper boys refused to carry William Martin Murphy's newspaper, the Irish Independent, and there was a terrible attack on workers on the streets of Dublin. We call it Bloody Sunday. There are 4 Bloody Sundays in the 20th century in Ireland, but this was Labour's one, when three strikers were beaten to death in a weekend of extreme violence, and that prompted James Connolly and Jim Larkin and a man called Captain Jack White to found the Irish Citizen Army to defend the workers against the brutality of the police. And by the way, a couple of months into its foundation, a number of women approached James Connolly and said, well, what about us? And Connolly, of course, said yes, absolutely. So it was an organisation that attracted men and women, and very much a grassroots socialist revolutionary organisation as well. But at the end of the strikes, which lasted really till January 1914, Connolly was clear where he laid the blame. He says, yes, he thanks the trades unions in England for sending a shipload of food, but he wanted more from them. He said, having asked for the isolation of the capitalists of Dublin, and for answers, the British Labour movement proceeded calmly to isolate the working class of Dublin, and so we Irish workers must go down to hell. Bow our backs to the lash of the slave driver, let our hearts be seared by the iron of his hatred, and instead of the sacramental wafer of brotherhood and common sacrifice, eat the dust of betrayal. Dublin is isolated. On the other hand, Connolly considered the battle to have been a draw. Some employers turned a blind eye to union membership, and so that they could just get their employees back to work, you know. Now, another major event, and it's hard not to talk about it, is the Great War, or World War I, that broke out in August 1914. And Connolly was very, very quick, as early as August 1914, to point out that this was just going to be the slaughter of the working class. And I love this quote of his: should the working class of Europe, rather than slaughter each other for the benefit of kings and financiers, proceed tomorrow to erect barricades all over Europe, to break up bridges and destroy the transport service, that war might be abolished, We should be perfectly justified in following such a glorious example and contributing our aid to the final dethronement of the vulture classes that rule and rob the world. If you wrote that yesterday, you'd think it was as relevant, wouldn't you? You know. Anyway, I think in some ways the outbreak of war was great for Connolly because the old phrase, England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity, and himself and many of people who were members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood noticed that as well. And in September, on the 9th of September 1914, Connolly was invited to an IRB meeting. He wasn't sworn in, but a decision was made there by people like Tomás MacDonagh, Tom Clark, Sean McDermott, Patrick Henry Pearce. They're all in this room together. Arthur Griffith was there as well. It was the Gaelic League Library, I think. And a decision was made that they should strike a blow. They didn't go, let's have an uprising in Easter 1916, but they said, we are now going to commit ourselves to striking a blow. And in October 1914, Larkin left for America. And James Connolly's hand was behind that as well, because he wrote to Big Bill Haywood in the States. He said, ask Larkin over for a lecture tour, and that got him out of the way. And it's no surprise that October 1914, a big banner appears outside Liberty Hall. Famous, you all know, we serve neither king nor Kaiser, but Ireland. And that's a sort of a seminal moment for Connolly as well. But of course, we're running out of time here very quickly, so I'm just going to try and speed up a little bit. In August 1915, there was a great funeral for Jeremiah O'Donovan Rasa, the old physical force nationalist. He died in America in June 1915, and Tom Clark wrote to John Devoy in America, send his body home at once. And a big, huge parade was organised. 30,000 people went out to Glasnevin Cemetery to bury Rasa, and the Citizen Army paraded in full uniform as well, and with weapons and what have you. You know, the volunteers were with them, coming on as well, the Fianna boys. And Connolly wrote, in honouring O'Donovan Rasa, the workers of Ireland are doing more than merely paying homage to an unconquerable fighter. They are signifying their adhesion to the principle of which Rasa, till his latest days, was a living embodiment. The principle that the freedom of a people must, in the last analysis, rest in the hands of that people. That there is no outside force capable of enforcing slavery upon a people really resolved to be free and valuing freedom more than life, which was quite incredible. Now, speeding ahead to 1916, there was a raid on Liberty Hall, the Union headquarters, a couple of weeks before the Easter Rising, and police were after a newspaper called The Gale, which had been banned. And somebody went, I think it was Helena Maloney, went to tell Connolly, and Connolly came down to the little shop, like the little shop down here, and he produced his weapon and he pointed it at the policeman, and in a very kind of a brilliant phrase, he said, drop those papers or I'll drop you, which is the kind of thing you only think of saying about 24 hours after the event. But if it was in a cowboy movie, you'd kind of go, well, that's a good line. But the police dropped the papers and skedaddled. So it gives you an idea that they feared Liberty Hall in many ways. They didn't want to provoke that hornet's nest, you know. But Connolly called for all the Citizen Army men and women to come there. He mustered them all, and in 1 hour they were all down in Liberty Hall. And from then on, it was guarded by armed Irish Citizen Army members, okay? Now, I'm not going to go into the Easter Rising because we've covered that subject so many times. Certainly I've covered it, but suffice to say that Connolly played a leading role as the Commandant General of the Dublin Division of the Army of the Irish Republic, and he fought very gallantly in the General Post Office and was one of the, he was the highest ranking of all the Army of the Irish Republic to be wounded in action. He was shot in the shoulder and he was shot in the ankle as well. So a very painful last few days for him in the post office. Pearce singled him out in a manifesto on Friday. If I were to mention names of individuals, my list would be a long one. I will name only that of Commandant General James Connolly, commanding the Dublin Division. He lies wounded, but is still the guiding brain of our resistance. Now, on Friday, Connolly also dictated to, I'm looking at a portrait of Winifred Carney here, his wonderful secretary. His message was directed to the soldiers of the Republic, and Winifred Carney typed it all up. It was a long sort of morale boosting message to hold firm, and he listed off all the commandants and spoke of how they were holding the line. Let us remind you what you have done, he said. For the first time in 700 years, the flag of a free Ireland floats triumphantly in Dublin city. And he finished off as follows: courage, boys, we are winning. And in the hour of our victory, let us not forget the splendid women who have everywhere stood by us and cheered us on. Never had man or woman a grander cause, never was a cause more grandly served. Which is very beautiful last piece. I'm just looking at my notes, and that's what it says there. You'd be glad to know, last piece, okay? So, as we well know, James Connolly was executed in a very horrific manner after 12 days of British doctors and nurses working on him in Dublin Castle to fix him up. They brought him up to Kilmainham Jail on the 12th of May. While he was in the ambulance, they placed a blindfold around him, most likely so that he wouldn't see his comrade Sean McDermott, who only 15 minutes previously had been executed by firing squad. And the firing squad was made up of over a dozen British soldiers. One of them was given a conscience round, a blank round, the objective being that you wouldn't lie in bed at night. You'd hope maybe you were the one who didn't shoot that man in the chair, you know, a wounded man. So the intensity, the ferocity of the firing squad was such that the whole chair, the back of it was blown away, which gives you an idea of what, you know, 11 bullets entering a body will do. But that is not the legacy of Connolly. That's one of his stories, you know, that he was executed in a chair. His legacy is that he was the great hero of the working man and woman in Ireland. But he's internationally known as well. And just for the sake of it, I'd like to tell you a few things that some of the socialists in Europe at the time would say about him. And later on, the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci called the IRA and those who fought for Irish independence the Green Bolsheviks. And Karl Redek dismissed the Easter Rising as a putsch and called the Sinn Féin movement petty bourgeois. And Leon Trotsky called the British imperialists downright bloodthirsty hooligans. Not quite as dismissive as Radek, but he was quite dismissive when he said the historical basis for a national revolution has disappeared even in backward Ireland. And he moaned about nationalist dreamers who ensured the preponderance in the working class movement of the green flag over the red, which is very similar to Sean O'Casey's views on James Connolly. However, we'll leave the last words with Lenin. He maintained such views were monstrously doctrinaire and pedantic, and said that the Easter Rising expressed itself in street fighting conducted by a section of the urban petty bourgeoisie and a section of the workers after a long period of mass agitation, demonstration, suppression of the press, etc. Whoever calls such an uprising a putsch is either a hardened reactionary or a doctrinaire hopelessly incapable of picturing a social revolution as a living thing. But earlier on I mentioned James Connolly's son, Roddy, and he went over to the Second World Congress of the Communist International in Petrograd, which is now called St. Petersburg, and was at one stage Leningrad as well. But Roddy said he met Lenin there, and I believe you have Roddy Connolly on the archives here in Oris Connolly. But Lenin told Roddy that Connolly was head and shoulders above all the socialists in Europe at the time. So I think we'll take Lenin's word on that, so we will, okay? It remains for me to shut up now. I want to say thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. I think it's an absolutely amazing amount of work that's gone in here, and fair play to everybody who is involved. And if you haven't been yet, come and visit. And thanks very much, and Sinead, Gurley Mila Mahagwith.